Welcome to the Global News Podcast. I'm Janat Jalil, and today I'm joined by our diplomatic correspondent, James Landale, who's in Moscow. And NATO leaders are meeting in Turkey as Russia appears to be struggling in its war against Ukraine, now in its fifth year. And James, how do you assess that the war is going for President Putin?
Well, it depends whose perspective you look at. From the Russian perspective at the moment, the authorities here insist the war is going all right. Vladimir Putin briefed his commanders just a few days ago, and both he and they were talking about the gains that they claimed they were making on the front line. They claimed that Russian forces had taken control of a key city in eastern Ukraine. And at the same time, the Russian authorities say that they're doing pretty well in the air war as well. Certainly, we know for a fact that over the last week, Russia has launched 3 substantial missile and drone attacks on Ukraine. So from the Russian point of view, in terms of the authorities, they are still insisting that they are ticking over, making progress. However, that is not the view of Ukraine. It is not the view of Ukraine's Western allies, who believe that Ukraine now has actually finally managed to find a key weakness in the Russian armory, namely its economy. And so in recent days and weeks, Ukraine has been targeting almost exclusively Russian oil refineries, so that at the moment there is a fuel crisis in Russia. And the Ukrainians hope that that will make a difference in the long run by bringing the war closer to home for ordinary Russians.
And that is the big question, isn't it? How will President Putin respond to the fact that there are now long queues for fuel, that people in Moscow and St Petersburg are seeing black smoke on the skyline as these oil refineries are hit? Will he change course?
Well, we certainly know that the Kremlin is aware of this and has felt that the situation is serious enough to acknowledge it. So Vladimir Putin has summoned in the cameras and given an interview to state television in which he's acknowledged the fact that there is a problem with the shortages, but he says that it's not critical. However, certainly the government is making efforts to try and counter that. They're trying to increase imports of refined fuel. They are subsidizing prices. They are allowing lower grade fuel to be distributed. But I think acknowledging that there is a problem is not the same as acknowledging that they are in any way going to change their war aims. The Russians have made it very clear, the government here, that at the moment they see no reason to change their war aims, which are still pretty maximalist. And Vladimir Putin, whenever he's asked about it or is saying anything in public about it, talks about claiming more territory in eastern Ukraine, which he insists is already Russian territory, and keeping going on that front. So at the moment, there's no sign that the Russian side is going to shift on this.
One big concern for NATO leaders at this summit is the warning that President Putin might be looking at opening up another front in Europe, possibly launching some kind of attack against a NATO ally.
Yeah, look, that is the big question that Western analysts and ministers and diplomats are struggling with at the moment, because if you accept that the Ukrainian actions now is putting economic pressure on the Kremlin that potentially could become political pressure, the Ukrainians are hoping that that persuades Vladimir Putin to come to the table, to agree, let's talk, let's have some kind of discussion about a potential political settlement to this conflict. However, there is another bunch of analysts who will tell you that actually in that circumstance, Mr Putin will not move to talks, but instead he will think of pushing back in some ways. And the question, therefore, is if Mr Putin were to escalate, how would he do that? And at the moment, Western analysts are going through the full gamut of potential possibilities, from stepping up actions on the front line in eastern Ukraine through to some kind of increased grey war attack on the west, or even some kind of action that actually prods NATO itself, potentially against Poland or Baltic. All of these things have been speculated about by the newspapers and analysts. And the question, though, is whenever you talk to those analysts, very few of them actually agree where they think the Russian leader may or may not move. Others say this. They say, actually, Mr Putin is actually quite cautious at times, and so it might be some time before we actually learn what the next move he's going to make is.
And he'll have been encouraged by President Trump's repeated criticism of NATO allies at the summit. President Trump has also been keeping in touch with President Putin, speaking to him before going to Ankara, and apparently he'll be speaking to him after he meets the Ukrainian President, Volodymyr Zelensky. So this is something that perhaps the Russian leader is hoping he can capitalise on.
Well, look, both President Zelensky and President Putin have been in a sort of a game of who can sweet-talk Donald Trump the best ahead of the NATO summit, both of them having conversations with him, both of them trying to get their narrative across. At the moment, the Americans seem to accept the Ukrainian narrative that actually, for the first time in a while, Ukraine is more on the front foot in this war than it has been. But at the same time, Donald Trump received messages from Vladimir Putin congratulating him on the 250th Independence Day anniversary celebrations over the weekend. They had a telephone call in which President Putin again invited Donald Trump to come to Russia for a visit, and essentially reinforcing the argument that, yes, Russia is in principle ready to accept some kind of political settlement to this war, as long as it is clearly on Russia's terms. But until that time happens, it is going to continue prosecuting this war on Ukraine.
Recent polls in Russia have indicated that President Putin's approval ratings are dipping, that people are very pessimistic about the economy, more pessimistic than they've been for decades. How secure is President Putin's position? Is there any internal threat against him?
It is true that his ratings have dipped a bit in the opinion polls. I mean, they're still pretty high compared to any to normal leaders in opinion polls. But for a Russian leader, they have dipped a bit as a result of some people's concerns about the state of the economy and the state of the war. But the question is, does that translate into real political pressure on the Kremlin? This is not a country where there are many vehicles for that pressure to be voiced. There are elections for the Duma later this year, so that gives at least some capability for voters to express some opinions. But at the moment, there's very little evidence of any kind of substantial political opposition driving the Kremlin into a different position on this, simply on the basis of the economic fuel shortage that they're going through at the moment.
And James, it does seem incredible how there has been this big turnaround in the past few months. We were talking just a few months ago about Ukraine being on the ropes, but now it seems that Ukraine has a newfound confidence, which seems to be largely down to its advanced drone technology.
Well, I think one thing we've seen during this war is quite a regular pattern of both sides' fortunes rising and falling at various stages, and sometimes that has been as a result of the outcome of military action on the battlefield. Sometimes it has been as a result of economic rise and fall. Sometimes it has been because of changes in support from Western allies giving more or less support to Ukraine. Sometimes, as you say, it's been a result of technological advance. But yes, at the moment, Ukraine believes it has the wind in its sails in a way that it hasn't for some time, and it hopes to use this moment to put more pressure on the Russian leadership to change its position. But at the same time, it's entirely possible that the situation remains pretty stable over the rest of the summer, and then come next winter, Ukrainian the authorities are really worried about the state of their energy capacity during the next winter, because so much of it was destroyed by Russia during the last winter, and none of this can be repaired in short order in time for next winter. So the Ukrainian authorities are doing their best to go around the world, finding as many portable generators as they can and bring them into Ukraine, so they've got extra charging capability to try and tide them through next winter. So it's entirely possible that the tide of this war flows in a different direction in the future. But you're right to say at the moment Ukraine believes it's got an edge simply because it has managed to find what it believes is an economic vulnerability in the Russian flank, and it's punching that bruise relentlessly at the moment.
James, thank you. That was James Landale, our diplomatic correspondent in Moscow. And if you'd like to hear more of the Global News podcast, please click on the link below.